Tackling the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution must start with changing how we understand water. But how are land, fresh water, coastal areas, and oceans connected? What are the relationships that we must understand and account for? And are today's governance structures capable of doing that? Or are they simply too fragmented? This is SIWI Corner at World Water Week 2023. My name is Andreas Karlsson, and with me on stage I have Ruth Mathews from Stockholm International Water Institute, Carina Barquette from Stockholm Environment Institute, and Andrea Rinaldo, who is this year's Stockholm Water Prize Laureate. Thank you for joining us. Now, Ruth, if I may start with you, and I mentioned in the beginning that there are connections here to be understood, and it's also there in the title of the session, Source to Sea, Understanding Source to Sea. Can you perhaps explain to us what these connections are?
I'd be happy to. It's one of my favorite subjects, I must say. What we're finding is that if you think about the water cycle, you might have learned about this in high school, for instance. Rain or snow falls on the land, it moves down into the rivers and lakes and aquifers, and then out to the coastal areas and the marine environment. And that becomes a connector between land, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems. And of course, once it goes into the ocean, evaporates and moves back upstream. So we have this cycle, and that cycle connects these the source to sea continuum. And so when we're talking about source to sea, what we're saying is that we really need to be thinking about and approaching our decisions, our governance, our finance, our investments in source-to-sea systems in this holistic view. We need to be thinking about those connections so that we actually are making decisions and choices that are benefiting the source-to-sea system as a whole.
And to what extent are we?
Unfortunately, most of our governance, so the way that we make decisions about water or the use of land areas, how we treat the coasts, what we do in the oceans, most of that is fragmented. We tend to like to work in our areas of expertise, and so our thinking is very siloed, and that means that we approach things in a very fragmented way and lose that sense of the connectivity between the land and the freshwater and the coastal and marine ecosystems. And this can lead to us making decisions that may benefit one part of the source-to-sea system, but at the expense of another part. And we see this a lot in terms of the impacts that land-based activities, the way that we manage our water resources, what we do to rivers and coastal areas, how that impacts the ocean, and then those impacts continue back upstream.
But this is interesting because what you said initially, so this is something that we have really learned in school, many of us, that there are these connections. Water is cycling around in the world all the time. Where did that knowledge and understanding get lost along the way?
Like I said, I think most of us have found that as we've matured, that we've tended towards focusing on one area and getting more expertise and knowledge and skill in that particular area. And so we narrow down and focus. And, just a personal story, I was on that path as a scientist, but I had to step away from it because I really did recognize this sense of we need to understand the whole, we need to understand the different disciplines and bring them together and be able to look at that holistic story, because that's how ecosystems work, that's how the planet works.
And what are the consequences of us not really accounting for these connections?
Well, we see it in how you started the program with the triple planetary crises. A lot of what's been pushing us towards the situation we have with climate change, with the loss of biodiversity, with the pollution in our waterways, on land, and in the ocean. A lot of this is happening because we have this narrow view of our activities and aren't recognizing that what we are doing is part of this whole. And so we are suffering on a daily basis, I would say, from this approach.
Karina, if I may ask you, your expertise lies, amongst other things, within oceans. And I know that you argue that oceans should really be at the center of this discussion. Can you explain that argument?
Sure. Perhaps I would like to start by some semantics, which when I started in this field really seemed like semantics, but the more I think about it, it's not just semantics. And there's one ocean, we have many seas, but yet we speak about oceans. Perhaps it's a failure of school. We all learned in school about different oceans, but really it's one ocean that connects us all. And with this in mind, I think I'd like to just put out some facts. Sorry to be the boring researcher here, but the ocean is the greatest climate regulator. Essentially, they've been absorbing carbon emissions up until today for about many billions of CO2, over 38 billion. So compared to what the land can absorb, it's about 28 times more than any land-based ecosystem. So when we speak about climate change and global warming, the ocean is also warming up. And what happens is when the ocean warms up, then that ability to absorb carbon dioxide and that ability to absorb heat decreases. And so this is going to create a rebound effect where we will experience even warmer climate than we are experiencing today, and a decreased ability to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is why the ocean should be at the center. Climate change is ocean change.
And I suspect it may not have to be said in this context, but just for the sake of it, how much are we talking about? How much of the Earth's surface is ocean, covered by ocean?
I think it's 98% of the Earth's surface is covered by the ocean. So it's the majority of our planet is the ocean.
Yeah. And to paint a bit of a background here, so how is the world's ocean doing?
Well, it's different depending on where you go, but generally I think we're speaking about increased ocean heat waves. I'm not sure whether you saw the news this summer, but there's been heat waves after heat waves throughout. And scientists have detected everything from extreme coral bleaches to species dying out all over, essentially, from the UK to the US, Asia, everywhere. So it's pretty bad. And what's most concerning is that the ocean is one of these ecosystems that we know least of. So things are happening that we won't be able to track down because we never even got there. So the magnitude of the damage is just the tip of the iceberg, basically, what we know about. Especially if talking about icebergs, just looking at the polar regions, there's catastrophic consequences of what's coming up, and this has been all over the news this summer. So it's no longer something we cannot engage with.
And may I just also add that the oceans provide food to like 4 billion people on the planet. It's really an important source of food, and of course if we can't get that food from the ocean, we also have to then rely on the land, and that puts more pressure there, which is part of the problem with the ocean, where we have pollution from our agriculture affecting the health of the ocean and therefore the health of our fisheries. And so there's many ways that there are cycles of impacts that go both from what we do on land down into the ocean, but then what does the ocean provide to us in ecosystem services for climate, but also for food and energy and all kinds of other activities that are really essential for our health and well-being.
I think that's a great point, if I can jump back, because I think you point on sort of the urgency of improving the governance of our ocean as the what we call the fourth industrialization is just around the corner. The ocean is becoming increasingly industrialized, and food is one of the most important ones, but not the only one. We see energy, cooling, but even water, potable water is increasingly coming from the ocean as we go back to desalination plants wherever we don't have any more potable water resources.
Yeah, because I imagine that the relationship or the is particularly intricate when it comes to coastal areas and ocean, and that coastal regions and the fast-growing coastal cities, they are very much affected by what's happening in the ocean and how the oceans are.
The oceans.
The ocean, sorry.
Exactly. So I mean,
Good.
the coastal cities are the entry point of any ocean dynamics. But really, as Ruth was pointing out, this is a water cycle. So we know it'll impact beyond coastal cities. It impacts our whole water cycle, really. And as we expand increasingly into our seas, then the impacts will also be greater, not just in the form of reduced climate services, but also in the form of increased impacts from extreme events.
And I think one of the things that can be interesting about coastal cities is, yes, they can be maybe in the most precarious position in terms of sea level rise and the ways that salt water can inundate groundwater and then affect potable water supplies. But they also put demands upstream of themselves on land for food, for energy, hydropower affecting the ecohydrology of rivers and what happens from that happening. So cities are very important in this connection, this source-to-sea connection, because they have a relationship both from being affected by how the ocean is changing, but also being an effector and impactor of creating that change.
Andrea, well, first of all, congratulations on being named the Stockholm Water Prize Laureate of 2023. Yeah.
Much appreciated.
We're talking about here how everything is connected through water, and you have really, through your research, contributed to the understanding of this and to the hydrological cycle. Do you feel that we understand these connections?
Well, it's a good question, but may I comment briefly on what Ruth and Karin had put forward? You don't have to tell me the importance and the feeling of how coastal settlements behave, because I was born and raised in Venice. Venice is naturally fragile and naturally exposed to what's going to happen. And the concern for what's going to happen because of the oceans rising, it's becoming, commonplace. It has to be seen if there's a meter more. And with the recent news we got from the Antarctic sea ice melting of this year, which is 6 standard deviations away from what we always measured in the last 30 years, it could be meters of water. So we are naturally sensitive to the fact that you have to wonder what to do with the built environment that cannot be relocated, essentially. So I am super sensitive to the issue. It's absolutely vital. And then what happens now, I'm a freshwater person, not a saltwater person. But of course, if you're talking about the oceans and you're talking about the hydrologic cycle, it was famously said that the hydrologic cycle and the cycle of life are one. It's the same thing, essentially. It's obvious, right? It was said famously that thousands have lived without love, but not one without water. That we know perfectly well. And as far as my work is concerned, what is the next stage and what's happening now, the transformation we're seeing these days, is the fact that we can actually put a price tag on ecosystem services now, reflected in water. And that's vital in a sense, because what you term as priceless means there's no economic value. So either you take it for granted or you don't care. And it's clear now that the wealth and the poverty of nations hinge on something which is, of course, measures of economic efficiency, GDP, gross domestic product, some measure of richness. But that cannot be all. You have to put into account the natural capital. if you don't take into account the conservation of natural capital, you won't have wealth of nations properly. And reflected in water, you have a quantitative way of especially, well, of course I'm biased, but if you see it through the river basin, not all protection of biodiversity, all the damages we have done to its conservation, slashing soils, slashing forests, and doing all kinds of things, it's not strictly only the river basin, but it's an important part of that. Well, seen from the angle of that perspective, we can actually make quantitative assessments, so evaluate fairly the natural capital. So in the future, we have a hope.
When you say that everything, and you have all said this now, that everything is connected, etc., yet you refer to yourself as a freshwater person, and I introduced you as an ocean expert. Is this being counterproductive that the water community segments itself in this way, rather than just saying that we're all water people?
That's all. I'm a water person,
yeah.
Yes, of course. But for instance, the connection that Karen made, of course, if you're talking about a large part of the reasons why we could reduce certain even water wars, look at the Palestine issue and Israel, in fact, largely stems from the fact that Israel found efficient ways of desalinating salt water and making a compelling case, in fact, for a stern conservation, that is civic education, which, well, in my country, it's complicated to enforce, actually, but in other contexts, in Switzerland, for instance, when it's a moral duty, it's going to be done. That is strong conservation forces, that is civic education, complete recycling of wastewater, reinjected into aquifers and then used for agriculture, and desalination is the reason why a country, which I admire very much, that is Israel, whose climate ranges from arid to semi-arid, exports potable water to Jordan, in fact, generates excess. So that's the way forward.
What do you say about this, my question about sort of segmenting the water world, Karina?
I think that's a great question, something that I grappled with when I started working with the ocean. So I come from the water previously, and I was surprised at how segmented things seem to be, especially entering the ocean water without being an oceanographer, a marine biologist, and coming from the water. There seems to be a bit of a shut space in many terms, which I can understand in terms of methodological research and tools needed to study the different aquatic landscapes. But since I work with people and policies, to me it made less sense to make that distinction. And the way what we learn, what we perceive about water, whether it's salty or sweet, it's not that big of a difference. There's many lessons to learn from the water and vice versa. And increasing that connection makes a whole lot of sense from a governance point of view, perhaps not from a modeling point of view, though actually I would disagree with myself at this point. I think we need connecting tools as well there.
Ruth, what do you think?
Well, this is at the center of a lot of my work. One of the things that SIWI does is host the Action Platform for Source-to-Sea Management. And the goal of that platform is to bring together organizations, across the whole source-to-sea system, across different sectors, including fresh and saltwater people, to work together towards this holistic management. Because we do see that, actually I agree with you, we do need the modeling that links what's happening upstream to the impacts to the coastal and marine environment, and we understand how changes in the marine environment come back and impact. So at the science level, that's very important, but also from our understanding of social and economic connections. It's very important for us to be able to sit together as different sectors, as different perspectives, to bring together that upstream and downstream perspective, to be inclusive of those who aren't traditionally involved in these decisions. So we bring in women, we bring in youth, we bring in indigenous peoples and marginalized communities to be part of the decision making. That's part of what's needed for this, for us to see the full picture. We can no longer make decisions based on a limited amount of information, I shouldn't say a narrow view of information. We need to broaden It's complex, obviously, but we need to live with that complexity because that's the world that we're in.
Andrea, I'd like to stick with you just for a bit here, because in this context, rivers are obviously an important part, and they are quite physically connectors, and we can see that with our bare eyes. And you have, in your research, and I should say that there will be a dedicated seminar on Wednesday morning to Andreas' research, but just touching on this briefly, you have introduced the concept of ecological corridors in this. Can you perhaps explain that a bit, what that is all about?
Yeah, thank you, of course. Well, the idea, hydrology, the science of water, is connecting essentially with floods, with droughts, and with fair distribution of water. What, a major transformation in discipline happened, I would say, in the early 90s, I would say, in which hydrology took center stage on a bigger debate because of a geometry of nature. So the realization by a French engineer, Benoit Mandelbrot, that mountains are no cones, that clouds are not spheres, nor coastline has simple broken lines, as he put it, nor does lightning travel in straight lines, meant that we look at nature with different eyes 3,000 years after Euclid. So the way we look at nature was essentially wrong. And later on, others realized that there are phenomena that are called self-organized critical. That means that in a system which has an enormous number of degrees of freedom, and in which you have different geology, climate, vegetation, you name it, and still there was an emerging feeling that there's something which is universal that happens all the time. And in fact, if I actually show you a map of a river and I take out the scale bar, you cannot tell whether it's the Amazon or the creek near Stockholm here. So because nature tends to make those structures at all scales. And this invincible capability to self-organize showed us something which was important to move onto something else. What's going to happen on those networks? Ecological corridors means when you have species, like living in the water, using the water, migrating through the riverways and the coastways. By the way, the so-called meta-history, or the history of history, the population migration that shapes communities as you see them today, were largely driven by where the water courses were. They needed the water for drinking, for energy, for transportation. And so the map of a river is a map of migrations. It turns out it's a map of how disease propagates, and it's a map of how biodiversity can be combined, can be conserved. And the kind of robustness that this universality endows the river systems is what allows us to evaluate quantitatively ecosystem services, and that's the natural capital. That was the main change of the last years. And for the first time, we have the feeling that, making just an example, which is, if, for instance, the World Bank has been financing many small work in sub-Saharan Africa, small dams, in sub-Saharan Africa, to try to make the best for agriculture of a system in which the precipitation is very intense, very ephemeral. You try to store it and use it and just channel it into irrigation canals, etc. So the point is that you can actually see the benefit that you have in those countries by the improved agriculture, but you don't see the price tag of a disease that they will get. Why? Because in the past you wouldn't be able to predict what would be the impact of debilitating or poverty-reinforcing disease. So essentially, through the new way, this long journey in which we looked at how nature works and how, in fact, river networks are universal and how certain phenomena that occur, like biological dispersion, settlement of biodiversity, conservation of biodiversity, and they all operate in sequence. So we are much empowered now. So the feeling is we can actually rethink distributing justice when it comes to water resources management. And this would be a long journey towards the reduction of inequalities on a global scale that hinges on water.
Mm. To what extent do you, as a scientist, think about the sort of significance and practical use of your research in sort of policy making, etc., or do you just put your findings out there?
Well, I'm an engineer.
Yeah.
So we're naturally vocated to do something which has practical use.
Yeah.
One important thing is that if you had, we worked a lot, we found out how rivers are in fact great ways of understanding where waterborne disease epidemics or water-based disease epidemics can be predicted. And this predictability gives you the confidence that you can actually intervene, you can actually advise containment measures, you can actually do something, to save lives. And this is really within reach for a number of diseases, and this is growing, actually. And I'm delighted that, that it was recognized as such.
Yeah. And this is, of course, where we now must aim, and particularly in a forum such as World Water Week. So where do we go, knowing all of these things and starting to understand them? What must we do? Karina, if you could tell the world's leaders what they should do based on what we have been talking about, what would that be?
What would that be? It sounds like I could write a letter to Santa right now, but I'll just stick to one thing, and that's think about your mobile phones. Would you buy a mobile phone that can only make calls? I wouldn't. I would want a mobile phone that can surf, make calls, etc. So why can't we think about water infrastructures and essentially all types of infrastructures and spatial planning the same way? I think water has suffered from our silo thinking and one benefit type of planning our space, where we devise an infrastructure for a single purpose. We need to think beyond that. What can give us multiple benefits, and how can we use the same structures for various purposes? First, to get more economic gains, get more for what you invest. Second, to decrease impact. Third, to reduce the amount of space, whether it's aquatic, marine, or even terrestrial. It makes sense in a lot of ways, but it demands that we think in a different way than what we've thought so far. So keep in mind your mobile phones next time you make a decision.
May I follow up? It's a very good argument. I can tell you something which I saw live, actually. I worked very much on cholera disease, and when in Haiti in early 2010, there was a major outbreak, by the way, generated by us, because the island had been free of cholera for like 200 years. And Haiti had been devastated by an earthquake, but destroyed whatever infrastructure was remaining in the country. There's nothing, poorest country in the world. No roads, no water supply systems, no police, no nothing at all. So I went there because I wanted to study how these propagated and how we planted it. And I saw with my eyes, in the market of Carrefour, the most dilapidated market, next to Port-au-Prince, one of the most dilapidated cities in the world, I saw with my eyes a young girl with one of those buckets on her body showing a Nokia 1900 and get a cabbage in return. What kind of society is one in which ownership of a cell phone is not socially biased and the water distribution system is instead? We cannot turn our head. Knowing where mobile phones are getting you means where epidemics will get you to. So phones are important, but at the same time, there should be a measure, because the infrastructure needed to put the cell phones in operation is there, and not the water distribution system.
And I will interrupt you there because we're close to our ending, and I will give the final word to you, Ruth, because I would also like to hear, what must we do now? What should world leaders do?
Well, I completely agree with what has already been said, and especially if we start thinking about how we need to rely on nature for that infrastructure and use nature to support us. What I would really like to see is that we mainstream source-to-sea thinking at all levels of government, so that as we're making decisions, they are informed by that holistic view of a source-to-sea perspective. We also need to invest in the science and the understanding of those connections at a social level, an environmental level, and an economic level, and we need to build the capacity and the behavior, the skill sets to actually do source-to-sea management in a coordinated and coherent way.
Thank you, and thank you all. This was SIWI Corner at World Water Week 2023. Join us again tomorrow, same time. Thank you.